there was a wealthy lawyer who was riding in the back of his limousine when he saw two men eating grass by the roadside. Puzzled by this, he ordered his driver to stop, and he got out of his car to investigate. "Why are you eating grass?" he asked one man. "Well, we don't have any money for food," the poor man replied. "Oh, well, come along with me then," instructed the lawyer. "But sir, I have a wife and 2 children." "Well, bring them along too," replied the lawyer. And he turned to the other man and said, "Why don't you come with us as well?" The man replied, "But sir, I have a wife and 6 children." And the lawyer responded, "Well, that's fine, bring them too." And the lawyer headed towards his limo. They all climbed into the car, which was no easy task, even for a car as large as the limo. And once underway, one of the poor fellows says to the man, "Sir, you are too kind. Thank you for taking all of us with you." And the lawyer replied, "No problem at all. The grass at my home is almost a foot tall." If you ever need a good joke, look for a lawyer joke. There's lots of jokes about lawyers. Well, while this story does certainly have a humorous tone to it, there is, of course, a sad truth to it as well. And it's not hard to see in our society that there is a widening gap between the haves and the have-nots, the rich and the poor. One does not have to go far to find a person who cannot afford to properly feed themselves. By some estimates, there are nearly 1 billion people in the world who are undernourished. That means that they are those people who cannot afford or do not have access to food that contains the nutrients that our body needs. In Toronto alone, each year, nearly 1 million people visit food banks every year. Now, for the most part, we've advanced to the point in our technology that we can produce enough food to feed everyone. But the problem is that the economic imbalance between cultures and societies, and even within our own society, there is this unequal distribution of wealth, and this prevents those in need from being able to attain what they truly need. Those of us who have always had food on the table sometimes forget the significance and blessing that the meal is. But this is not so for the poor. And it is not so for those living in biblical times. If we recall last week, I shared about how the perspective of the Scriptures is the perspective of the poor. That most of the Scriptures we have are written from people who are struggling just to survive, struggling even to eat and have food. For these people, food tells a story. It has meaning and significance that goes beyond its nutritional value. Where it came from and how they receive it, how they use it, carries a significance far deeper than just what it's composed of materially. Now, we see traces of this in our Old Testament reading today. This reading reminds us of the significance that the Passover meal has for the Jewish people. Passover, recall, was a lamb supper eaten as a solemn reminder of the sacrificial lamb the Hebrew people had killed and ate in Egypt in order that their family would be passed over by the angel of death, the most horrific of the plagues that afflicted Egypt. It reminds the people that God is their protector and their deliverer, that He has rescued them from slavery in Egypt. And now we find ourselves in the place where Joshua, their leader, is leading them into the promised land. And on the eve of this challenging adventure, God reminds them through the Passover that today I have rolled away from you the disgrace of Egypt. In Egypt, the people experienced subhuman standards of living. That time is now over. They are now being restored and given the dignity of being free people, as God's people, and they've been restored. And they celebrate that reality by feasting, by eating Passover. Recall that for 40 years they've been eating manna in the desert, this spongy white stuff. Manna literally means in the Hebrew, what is this? What's this stuff? It was less than appetizing, but this is what they had to sustain them. It was God's miraculous provision for them, but it was also a reminder that they still didn't have the ability to produce food for themselves. They were still a people without a land. But the story continues today. The manna ceased on that day, the day they ate the produce of the land. And the Israelites no longer had manna. They ate the crops of the land of Canaan that year. So here we have this shift, this change in the story. And this Passover marks the significance of the people, of their salvation that's brought about by their God. And they eat off the land as a tangible way of receiving the blessing of God's promise. Their dignity is being restored as they are made able to provide for themselves. Food then becomes something sacred for the people. It's why God gave them all kinds of laws and rituals around food. What they could and could not eat, when they could eat, who they could eat with, what they had to do to purify themselves before a meal. Some today, through science, have found that many of these laws and provisions have sanitary benefits. We can also see that the law around the Sabbath and letting the land rest for a year every 7 years has agricultural benefits as well. But principally these laws, or the Torah, were about preserving the sanctity of the Jewish meal in the sense of the food, but also maintaining a unique identity in the midst of a plethora of influential cultures. As Israel took up residence in Canaan, they were surrounded by many different peoples and cultures that worshipped many different gods. And keeping the law for Israel became of paramount importance so that the people would not lose their identity. For some, their lives became consumed with interpreting and preserving this tradition, food laws included. And they became ever more concerned with these things so much that if it would come across anyone who would break with tradition or challenge their beliefs, they would hold it against them. Perhaps they would even become outraged and maybe even violent. And this is the context of our gospel reading today. Those consumed with ritual and tradition, the group that the gospel writers call the Pharisees, are appalled that Jesus and his disciples are eating with sinners, eating with people who are deemed ritualistically unclean. By doing so, Jesus and his friends aren't keeping all the strict observances around food. They're not keeping all the laws. And so how would Jesus respond then to this criticism? Well, he responds by telling them a story about the hungry son. Yes, most of us here know this story of the prodigal son, or perhaps the story of the lost son. But today I'm calling it the hungry son, because the issue of food and hunger is central to it. The story starts with a privileged young man taking for granted all that he has. He decides that he wants to spend his share of his family's wealth his own way. And so he gets his money and heads into the city. Here he overspends, living beyond his means as a consumer with no restraint, and he experiences the consequences. His greed and short-sightedness result in him spending all his inheritance on dissolute living, the scriptures say, which probably means lavish meals, plenty of drink, and most likely prostitutes, as we hear from his brother's criticism at the end of the story. His free-spending ways land him with no money and no food, and no means to provide for himself. A recession hits in the form of a famine, and he began to be in need, Jesus says. So he hires himself out to a local citizen, desperate, and he becomes a hired hand working in the fields with the pigs. Imagine, here is a man, presumably a Jewish man, who's not even allowed to eat pork. And here he is, the irony is he's having to feed the pigs. And he's so hungry that he wishes even that he could have the food that he is giving to the pigs. But no one gave him anything to eat. At last he learns what it truly means to be hungry, to be one of those on the other side. He's lost his dignity and he's learned the true value of food. But he's also lost his pride and arrogance. And he comes to himself, the story says, and he thinks about his father's servants and how they're treated better than he is right now. And so he decides to go home and to beg only for the status of a servant of a benevolent master. Before he reaches home, however, he is intercepted by his father, and he's welcomed home with open arms. Such is the delight of the father that he orders a homecoming party. He dresses his son and he orders a feast. He commands that the fatted calf would be slain in celebration of his son's return. Here we find another feast. Like the Passover feast with the slain lamb, like the ram God provides Abraham to spare his son Isaac, the father orders a fatted calf slain so that they can celebrate the deliverance of his son out of poverty and slavery, out of death into life. The fatted calf was reserved for very special occasions, for visits by the important, to mark rites of passage. And here the sheer joy of the Father is matched only by his generosity. He rightly makes a meal, a feast, to celebrate that his son will be hungry no longer. Today, the feasts of Passover and the feast of the hungry son remind us of the central role food places in our lives. In the season of Lent, we are also called to remember the poor, as we know that one of the ancient disciplines is that of almsgiving, of caring and meeting the needs of those who are poor, for those who hunger in society. Some of us are currently fasting something or another. And this is a spiritual discipline that puts us in touch with that basic drive of hunger, that it may humble us and make us grateful for what we do have. It ought also to place us alongside those who have real hunger, to identify even in a little way, those who are in need. And we ought to consider the hungry of the world and see what we can do to alleviate their suffering. Our story that we heard this morning ought to caution us about the extravagance and self-centered way in which we consume and may spend our wealth. Perhaps it can inspire us to search more deeply the issues of hunger, of world hunger and poverty, and what we can do to get involved to make a difference. Perhaps we can do something simple just in our own lives, like the next time we're thinking of going out for a meal, we may decide to instead to go without a meal, to fast that meal, to take the money we would have spent out on the meal and to use it to buy groceries to bring to the food cupboard here at St. Matthew's or to a food bank nearby. Perhaps we can get involved tackling the systemic issues by researching what our government is doing or could be doing to help eradicate poverty in our culture, in our society. The issue of the meal and food is a central image in our scriptures. And today, in just a few moments, we will celebrate another meal, another feast, a meal centered around the death and resurrection of Jesus Christ, our Paschal Lamb. As we do so, may we be reminded of the great generosity and grace of our loving Father. But may we also remember the mandate to extend generosity to those in need, and especially to those who hunger. Amen.